Good. Okay, we are live streaming and recording. Call to order this special meeting of the Joint Easton, Reading, and Region 9 Policy Committee. Present in attendance, we have Chris, Maureen, and Gwen, and myself. First item on the agenda is actually not correct. So the first, after call to order, sort of agenda item number 2, approval of meeting minutes from the October 9th. We did not meet on October 9th because we had a sort of issue with sort of quorum dropping in and out, and so we didn't meet. And so it wouldn't be the minutes from the 9th, but because this is a special meeting, we're not able to change this agenda item. We actually need to approve the previous week's. So it should be the 2nd, I believe. So we'll fix that next time and approve the meetings from the 2nd, as well as this meeting next week. Moving on to public comment. Seeing no members of the public present, we'll move on to committee member comment. Hearing none, move on to item number 5, discussion and possible action. We have 2 items today. We've been working through the sort of resuming that work on the 3000 series, and we've been making good progress. And we are also, I think, waiting for guidance on the Title IX piece. So we may get to that today in the discussion. But the first item and sort of the sort of change to our sort of regular agenda that we wanted to make for this was to discuss the tri-board governance portion of our policy. We're approaching a meeting of the Easton, Reading, and Region 9 boards and thought it would be worthwhile to take this specific piece of language and sort of for us to discuss it here and to start making movement amongst the boards to get some agreement on this language. I think, Chris, you had originally put together some sort of sample language on this topic, I think sort of in the summer. And I think it would be worthwhile just sort of walking through that. Can I ask, because I incorporated that language into our joint policy committee document. I wasn't sure if there had been changes. Sorry, it was right above the enumerated.
I think the only change that I would have made since I shared that with you originally in the summer was I had one technical issue with the mechanism, which is that you need to vote 3 times before it's considered approved, not 2 times.
Okay.
I made that change before circulating it to the committee earlier this week, but
okay.
A minor issue.
Yep. Okay. Oh, here comes Dr. Harrison. 2 to 3 second times considered approved. Okay, so this language right here should be amended to include the more recent content.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's just basically the mechanism requires 3 2/3 votes, not 2 2/3 votes. From what I understand from having talked to folks who've been around for a while.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Dr. Harrison. How are you?
Doing all right.
Good. Okay, good. So so I'll put that language in. Do you want to walk us through, or do you want me to try to sort of summarize?
I mean, you can walk through if you'd like. Basically, the genesis of this was some conversations from the spring and some sort of friction amongst the tri-boards when we were meeting as around the superintendent transition, and making sure that thinking that it would be helpful if all 3 boards had a common understanding of what our operating relationship was, as the boards turn over with some frequency. And we were looking at an administration turnover, and it's important that we all sort of have a playbook to run by and rely on. So we're not relying necessarily on the loudest voice in the room or the person who happens to bring the right precedent to the right conversation at the right time, or doesn't, to steer the governance of the 3 boards. So the goal here was to try to capture the essence of why we meet the way we do, how we meet, and nothing here is intended to be invented out of whole cloth. It is entirely trying to document a process that I understood to currently exist.
Is it also worth? Is it also true to say, simply because it's always been done one way in the past, like we're open to, if we think there's a more efficient path, then we're open to that.
100%. And I circulated this as here's kind of the floor of what I understand the relationship to be. And if there are areas in which we can make efficiency adjustments, we should absolutely be doing that. And I think that in the context of the tri-board meeting in a couple of weeks, if we're going to present this, we identify those issues for which we are departing from norms so that we can have that conversation collaboratively.
Good. That's great. Okay.
This is the time in the meeting where I ask you to make your screen bigger.
I swear we really have to put it on the agenda.
It's like
I
policy
didn't do
committee
this
thing.
at least this time.
Every time.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome. All right.
The free square on the bingo card. John makes the screen bigger.
That's right. And you know what? And just for my purposes today, I think I'm really going to punch that up.
Yay!
Yeah. Good. Okay. All right. So starting with item number 1. So meeting of the 3 boards jointly shall be chaired in an annual rotation set to the calendar year. The chairs of the respective board chairing the tri-board shall chair such meetings.
Do you want to start at the very top and the sort of statement of principle?
Absolutely. Sorry. Yep. Sorry. I thought I was scrolled to the top. You're right.
Nope.
Good. Thank you. Good. So ER9 structure exists to facilitate the sharing of the superintendent and senior staff between 3 independent school districts. It is not its own legal entity. Okay. That's, do we want to say that is sort of the tri-board is not its own legal entity?
Yes.
Okay. Its value rests in the decisions by 3 boards to cooperate and increase municipal ROI by sharing resources. That's great. It is in the best interests of all students in the 3 districts for ER9 to operate as closely to a single 5-school district as is reasonably possible. Effort should be made to horizontally and vertically align curriculum to that end to improve both efficiency and performance. Cool.
I don't think that's objectionable. I'm not sure that that's ever been stated before.
Yeah, and it's one of these things that we kind of we live with as like this unstated principle that I could imagine if somebody looks, it's here in our peripheral vision, and there may be members of the boards who, when they look straight into its eyes, they go, "Oh, wait a second, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that."
Right.
And so we
I
should talk about.
I don't think the boards have ever formally committed to, we are going to prioritize horizontal and vertical alignment. I think a lot of Stephanie's work over the past 8 years has been in that direction.
Right.
But I think that's been in sort of an administrative prerogative. And I think it's helpful to align the board's expectations with the administration's in that respect.
Yeah, and I would also say that I think it's 2 separate principles. Like when we talk about the vertical alignment, I think we're going to get a lot more agreement, and I don't think we're going to have an issue with sort of people saying, yes, a graduate of one of our respective districts who sort of deal primarily with K through 8 are should be going on to the high school and capable of doing what's necessary at grade 9. But that conversation about a 4th grader in Reading and a 4th grader in Easton should be relatively.
To what degree should their experience be the same?
Right. So that one may sort of spur a little bit more conversation, but I think it's essentially like, in order to get to the vertical integration, you need the horizontal.
Right. And I think that's the way you would sort of, if you got pushback, you would condition it to say, we're committed to a vertical pre-K-12 integration. And in support of that, we will make steps to horizontally align the curriculum in support of that vertical integration. And that basically says that the only required horizontal alignment is that which is necessary to support vertical alignment. So you don't necessarily need karaoke in both elementary schools, but you definitely need to be on the same page with how you're teaching math so that when you can get to the high school, you're speaking the same language.
Yep. Okay. I really like that language, and that might help to sort of fend off some of the, some of the concerns that we might hear. And I also really like the idea of a karaoke course. Stephanie, is that like 4 out of 5 probably possible?
Well, so you made the joke about karaoke, but we do have similar examples of, for instance, the snowshoeing and cross-country skiing that occurs at RES. And then for years, the Orff Ensemble that also was an RES specific experience. And the difference between that and the sort of the general, what is the general music program? What is the general PE program? So,
Right.
I mean, this is absolutely the focus of my work, and in many ways what makes it challenging because of different resources and personnel and historical practices in the two K-8 districts.
Okay. Do we want to try to make an edit here to include the sort of the stronger statement of sort of vertically aligned and to the extent necessary horizontally aligned, or do we want to just move on with what's the preference from the group?
I personally would not add to the extent necessary. I think it's
Okay. Shoot for this, and if people push back, then we have this in our back pocket.
Right. Understand what the alternate looks like, basically.
Yep. Yeah. Good. Okay.
Are there any other sort of
general
core
principles?
principles or high level things that we should be laying out as sort of baseline table stakes for discussions about the structure? I mean, do you want to put something about that that they have common ownership of a central office budget or something?
Yeah, that's yep. Yeah, I think something. I think something about like the obligation to each other that we have because of this shared ownership of resources, shared responsibility for those resources. Okay.
I mean, you could say in that first sentence, this includes but is not limited to a shared central office budget that is allocated equally between the 3 independent school districts.
right. So the first principle talks about the senior staff, but all of the central office staff are shared and require sort of common agreement and commitment from all 3.
I think that the primary purpose of saying that it's the superintendent and senior staff that are shared is the purpose of the structure is to share those individuals. A side effect of that purpose is that they also have staff that are shared. Like, I don't think we exist to share support staff. We exist to share central leadership.
Yes.
This includes but is not limited to a shared central office budget that is
allocated equally between the boards or something like that, or
not always allocated equally, though. It's population dependent, so I don't know that I would use.
Well, it's allocated equally between the boards, not the towns.
Okay, the responsibility for the budget is allocated equally between the boards.
Although then you're going to get the semantics of really it's 33, 33, 34. Not that anybody would say that.
I'm sure someone would.
We just say allocated amongst the boards?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'm just going to close that one out. We know sort of what we would say there if we need to. Okay, moving to meeting governance. Meeting of the 3 boards jointly. We read this before. So 2020 Region 9, 2021 Reading, 2023 Easton, etc. Motions must be made and carried by all 3 boards separately. Okay. Tri-board meetings are 3 boards meeting jointly. Good. Motions must be approved separately by each of the 3 boards to be considered approved with respect to joint allocation of resources.
I mean, is that a statement that is also true more broadly? with respect to this, the way this is written is narrowed to just allocation of resources. In theory, motions need to be approved by all three to take any joint action, but to the extent that there is, take it in the context of a resolution and say, we resolve that, we think that Rydell is great. And one board passes it and two boards either say, this isn't really appropriate for us, or, we disagree, or whatever it is. That motion is still passed and adopted by that one board, and that one board owns it.
Yeah.
And it's still correct. Which is why I think I put the language about allocation of resources, because that's the only really thing that that or the creation or suspension of joint policies or committees.
I mean, wouldn't it be true to just stop at the word approved?
Yes.
Would you say approved by the tri-boards then?
I think maybe we need to qualify
No, I
here, right?
think-
Motions affecting, where we need to make a joint decision, right? Motions requiring a joint decision must be approved separately by each of the three boards to be considered approved.
I think it's good to just leave it after approved, for what it's worth. I think you have your wiggle room then.
And then the next sentence creates sort of the exception.
Right. And yeah, in the event a motion carries two of the three boards, it fails. However, the boards may elect to vote a second time. And this is the part where we say, and the language you have, sorry, I'm going to pause the share and just go grab that.
Yep.
So I'm not trying to recreate it here.
You didn't pause the share.
Huh, tried to. Pause. You can look at me opening the agenda. Okay. Oh, you also have another section here for policies. I'm going to grab that too.
Okay. And while you're doing that, with respect to the motions must be approved by all three, it might make sense to put in the introduction of that, except as set forth herein, because
Yeah.
you're creating an exception in the next sentence.
All right. Okay. Okay, and then we'll come back to the policy section here. Okay. Okay. Except where,
I would say at the beginning of it, except as set forth herein, comma, motions must be separately approved.
except where, what's the word you're using there?
Otherwise set forth herein.
Otherwise set forth.
Now
many
there's the
legal
real
words
legal
can I put in a row?
jargon is coming out there, Chris.
Yeah.
In the event a motion carries two of the three boards, it fails. However, the boards may elect to vote a second time on such a motion. And if it carries two of the three boards a second time, it may be voted on a third time. If it passes two out of three boards three times, it is considered approved. This is what has commonly been referred to as the mechanism. I love that. I'm writing a book called The Mechanism. Okay. So this is something that has been a practice, but is not enshrined in policy today.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. So I
Which makes it
suspect
sort of dangerous.
I suspect this is going to be a topic of significant debate.
It has certainly been used.
Yeah.
And I would say even within the last 5 years.
Can you
Okay.
give me examples of when it has been? I've not seen it used.
Yeah,
so-
it was a central office budget approval process a number of years ago.
Okay.
And it was a contentious discussion, and the mechanism was used.
Okay.
Going back 5+ years now, I think.
I want to say it's the year that we approved the central office budget at minus $1 or something.
Or plus $1.
Yeah, right. I do remember that $1 was a part of the motion.
Okay.
Okay. All right, good. The purpose of joint meetings is to carry out business that relates to the sharing of resources between districts, including but not limited to the central office budget, take action on recommendations of joint committees, improve efficiency by consolidating presentations and other reports that contain information applicable to all three boards in substantially equal part, such that it is only presented once rather than separately to all three boards. Good. We're all comfortable with that?
Mhm.
The joint board should endeavor to keep their role in appropriate focus, both with respect to governance generally and with respect to the subset of that governance that is properly within the jurisdiction of the boards acting jointly. E.g., if an allocation of $2,000 is not a topic for enormous conflict and discussion at the individual board level, it is not germane to a joint board discussion.
That's where you're going to have mutiny about my language, but that's.
Why?
I don't know that you need that example. I mean, I understand why you're putting it there, but
Right. Basically, because there are folks who think that a $50 expense is worth 21 of us arguing about, even if it's not necessarily worth arguing about in the context of throwing $20 million budget.
you're
Yeah.
going to have to manage that as those instances arise by having chairs that are strong enough to say, mm-mm.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Moving on.
Let's table this. We can settle this. You know, this is a relatively small matter that we can handle.
Yeah, I think that parenthetical came from sort of a salty mood that I was in, so you can take it out.
Good. Okay. We can come back down to this language that we had in there, but we should go back to this specific policies section that I think was not in the original that we were looking at a moment ago. Superintendent is the CEO of each of the three districts. She or he is an employee of the three boards. The superintendent has broad discretion to hire staff throughout the three districts or to delegate that authority to other appropriate individuals. The superintendent shall meet and confer with the three boards in the hiring of the assistant super for curriculum and instruction, the director of finance and operations, any other senior level position that may from time to time be created, any position with compensation in excess of $150,000 perhaps.
I don't know that I would put a dollar number on that.
Yeah, I agree. The
I think that that's-
parentheticals are just sort of.
Yep. Discussion. The boards or their shall give advice to the superintendent in these hiring decisions, but their consent is not required. To the extent the boards are dissatisfied with one or more hiring decisions, the remedy is to counsel or discipline the superintendent. The boards have delegated the role of negotiating terms of employment with senior central office staff to the joint negotiating committee.
I think the language, the boards or the delegates shall give advice to the superintendent in these hiring decisions, but their consent is not required, is going to cause some consternation. And I think it should be which advice shall be considered, or something that puts it incumbent upon the superintendent to actually consider the advice. I think that kind of language would be a little bit more palatable.
Yeah,
And it's not going to get the immediate pushback that you're going to get. from
Right.
this.
The superintendent is required to accept and consider the advice,
Right.
but is empowered to reject it, basically.
Right, but you need to at least take that little baby step forward.
because we have had search committees for positions other than superintendent. And I believe that all these senior staff have individual contracts with the board, right? With the boards, they're not staff like everyone else.
But they're not employees of the board. They're not direct employees of the board. They're employees of the superintendent.
Well, I think isn't that where the debate is?
Well,
There shouldn't be, because statutorily we only employ the superintendent.
would it be true to say that the teachers are employees of the board?
Right. The
No.
same.
Aren't they employees of, well, yeah, they are.
I was just trying, because with the distinction that I have heard drawn previously is that you have, teachers who have a group contract and like that versus senior level employees who have individual contracts with the three boards. So that's just a distinction that I have heard. So yeah, this is definitely going to generate discussion.
Yeah, I think it is too. I think the distinction that has been in my mind is that the sort of the terms of the contract. I think we're saying sort of the sort of senior administration, the sort of members of the administration from central office, the sort of terms of the contract. We're putting it in here that we have a negotiating committee for that, but the hiring and firing would be the discretion of the superintendent.
I mean, Scott's contract is signed by Dr. McMorrin. It's not signed by the board chairs.
Right.
The only
I
contract
don't know that was
signed
my issue, the mechanism of how this works. My issue was more the degree to which the superintendent has to consider the advice of the board. So maybe we've got two issues floating here.
I think we have two issues. I think Gwen is articulating another issue that I think is going to come up, and I think will actually be the
primary issue.
Yeah, I think will be the primary issue of discussion here. So I think it's like figuring out what is a reasonable sort of actual policy and figuring out the right way to articulate that. I think it's reasonable to say that the superintendent is the sort of employee of the board and has the discretion to do the hiring and firing.
I mean, this relates back to a policy that we had discussed in February with Tom about the hiring of principals and assistant principals and the obligation to bring how many finalists do I need to bring to you, who ultimately has the control. And there was a policy about you need to bring 3 finalists. And I think we said, it seems kind of silly to have a required number because there might only be 1 or 2 that really fit into that criteria. But the operating understanding and expectation was it was ultimately the superintendent's call, although the sort of advice of stakeholders was certainly valuable in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it would be foolish for any superintendent to choose someone who had received considerable negative feedback.
Right.
And I think we have a larger issue with the superintendent if that's the issue.
And part of why we're having this whole conversation is to avoid future contention about it and sort of put to bed the question of how are we doing this? Right. And if the answer is we're doing this by creating a search committee for every senior position, then, and that's the consensus, that's what we're doing. But my view is pretty sort of firmly in the camp that we employ the superintendent, and the superintendent has discretion as to his or her cabinet and everything on down. And, building the process should be that person's prerogative, more or less, within whatever confines we create here.
It might be worth saying as a part of this discussion, because I think reasonable people would have different perspectives on this. And I think it also comes back to what our role is as board members versus that of the superintendent and sort of central office staff and building leaders and all of that. And I think there's a fair amount of disagreement about what the appropriate role is. But I think it's worth saying what we have done in the past and sort of what we are doing now, what we are proposing to do now, are all within the bounds of the sort of statutory requirements.
I kind of wonder whether we should get sort of a third eye view on this from either CABE or Shipman to come in and say, here's standard practice, or here's the expectation, or here's where your sort of guardrails are, so that we don't go into October 27th with all kinds of cockamamie ideas on the table.
I think that's a very good idea. And frankly, I could imagine getting advice from both and saying, you guys deal with enough people. I mean, CABE certainly, but Shipman as well. Like, how is this normally done? In other conversations that we've had recently, up to and including the sort of who's doing hybrid, who's going all in, when we've been able to bring to the sort of the all of the members of the various boards something like, look, 50% of people are doing this and 50% of people are doing this, it lets us all just kind of take off the handcuffs and say, oh, okay, so we're able to apply our judgment right now, as opposed to saying, well, are we going to be way outside of the norm if we choose to do A, B, or C?
Right, because I'm concerned that if we bring this proposal to the tri-boards, some people will view it as us sort of putting our thumb down on the scale in one way or the other.
Right.
And if we had sort of an objective view,
Yep.
whether it
That's
supports
very valid.
my view or not, would be valuable.
It's a persuasion mechanism more than an advice mechanism.
Yeah, and if everywhere else they're doing, like, I'm open to that. I disagree with it, but again, like you said, Chris, if everybody, if the boards are all going to say we want to have a search committee for every position, well, then we could enshrine that as the policy.
Well, I think it's just inconsistent how we've been doing it. I mean, we've had, the middle school principal, we've got a search committee and a consultant and all kinds of stuff to try to find somebody for John Reed. But then sometimes for a central office position, we don't have a search committee and we just hire somebody. So that's, I think, something that I don't know.
I would view those as apples and oranges, though, because I think a building leader is somebody who leads a community of stakeholders that includes students and parents, as well as board members and faculty. Whereas the director of finance and operations, for example, is largely a back office function that is not engaged and is not a community facing and interacting position. And it's much more important that the director of F&O be engaged and on the same plane with the people that she is going to be working with all the time than a principal for whom you want to get that community feedback. And ultimately, the principal search committee leads to a recommendation and a hiring decision by the superintendent, not by the board.
Okay. I'm just saying, do we distinguish between positions that require community buy-in and search committees and positions that do not require community
I think it's probably an important conversation. And to the extent that we put it into here, it's not a crazy thing to sort of air out and have an understanding. Like, if all three boards agree that their principals, but not their assistant principals, require a community search, let's write it down and let's all agree to it so that we're not all pointing fingers at each other when some job arises somewhere. Is director of special ed on this list, but not supervisor, or is neither?
Right. I think it's really interesting, especially to explore the sort of what are the motivations for sort of pulling together this whole search committee, including sort of the sort of the degree to which you need to hear from members of the community and all of that, and sort of where do you need that, where don't you need that, can you achieve that by way of sort of a process that the superintendent is driving, or alone, or do you need to have a search committee? I think it's all very sort of, it's worthy of conversation.
I mean, I'd like to hear from Rydell and Stephanie a little bit on this point as to where it is that they find these procedures to be burdensome versus helpful.
So I can speak sort of a little bit historically, and then certainly interested in what Rydell has to say. I mean, I do believe that when we're in a time of significant change, or if significant change is desired, that's when we tend to have a larger group involved in the process. There have certainly been decisions that have been made with a much smaller group when there's an urgency to have someone assume a position, and there's, in the superintendent's view, a very strong candidate that is appropriate for the position. So I'm thinking about, for instance, the time that we were reorganizing special education, and we had, I don't know if any of you recall that time, but we had interviews set up at the high school, and we had the candidates rotating from space to space, and we had community members involved, we had board members involved, we had administrators involved. And that also included a time when there was a special education study, right? So that was a big change, and it was a big process. There have been other changes. So we'll use the hiring of the RES principal as an example. So not a huge significant change, so board members were involved in the final interviews, and representation from the association, and of course other administrators. But it didn't involve a search consultant. It didn't, so, and then the John Reed process is different because there was a principal in place for so long. And the thought is that, we're looking for significant change and a broader search and the involvement of a consultant. So I think historically that's been our practice, although I think we all know that if you begin to get into history, that will make for a 3-hour conversation about every single hire that's been done in the last 10
But what
years.
about 1997, Stephanie?
Yeah.
Yeah. So exactly. So I'm just thinking there is a logic to the process that has been followed, at least in my opinion. But I'm in favor of sort of looking forward and setting some general parameters.
What's the sort of best practice going forward? And do we have certain triggers that say, the board in its prerogative may blah 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 blah, and it takes an affirmative step of creating a search committee if certain circumstances exist. But I'm also not interested in overcomplicating this, because I do believe that it's important to maintain the governance and administration distinction.
Yep. Yeah. And that, I wonder if there's a sort of, it's sort of off topic from, it's a tri-board specific policy, but the sort of, I find significant confusion amongst people who have spent quite a bit of time on the boards about what their role is. And that then leads to this sense like, well, I should be involved in every hiring decision. And, it doesn't take long to sort of say, including teachers. And
some of that is a symptom of small town, one board member for over 150 kids.
Right.
And every time there's a hire or a teacher or somebody in the community is going to come to you and say, John, why is Mrs. Jones the new X grade teacher? She is awful in these 3 ways. What did you have to do with this?
Right.
And can't you stop it?
Right.
So.
All right. So, Chris, will you reach out to Shipman, or what should our process be? We're going to go to Shipman and CABE.
I can handle both and
Okay.
see. And the CABE thing might be a listserv question.
Yep. When you send that out, I'll reply to it. Say, what a great question.
I know Shipman has done professional development sessions with board members to talk about roles and responsibilities. Has that happened with the tri-boards? Or, I think CABE does it too.
CABE came to the Reading board in early 2018 and had that conversation.
And do you feel as though it has made a difference?
I think that the folks who came on the board at that time also went to the CABE half-day training about roles and responsibilities. And 1 or 2 of them in particular have a very clear view of what the lines of demarcation are in the roles and responsibilities. I think it's sort of blurry elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot to be said for regular refreshers from third parties with respect to what the roles are, because the 4 of us or the 6 of us could beat that into anybody's head, and they're just going to not believe it because they have their own understanding, and that's just is what it is. For the same reason that Maureen was saying it's persuasive authority to have somebody else telling you. Yeah. I don't think that the tri-boards have ever undertaken a joint board professional development exercise. I think it would be a healthy thing to try. I just don't know in the age of COVID how you're going to do that successfully without also having 100 people there sort of watching on Zoom and creating a different level of discomfort. Because the advantage of the board retreats are you can hold a public meeting and you can just know that because the agenda is so weird, nobody's going to show up, and you can yell at each other to your heart's content.
Well, so I think I actually have been thinking about this as something that I might want to add to the agenda for my own meetings, because I think the public would benefit from hearing what the role of the board is of any given board member as well. Because it's even if all of our board members are sort of perfectly aligned and understand sort of the right way to engage and where the line is, that doesn't mean that the public has any understanding of that. And when the public comes and says, "Hey, board member, do this," that job is a lot harder.
I mean, we have no, I know in Reading, and I assume the same is true in the other two boards, there is no board member onboarding process.
We have it in our bylaws that we are supposed to do that. And I've done that for the people who have joined since, well, basically just Evan, who's joined since I've been the chair. But it was like, we need an actual process for.
It's congrats, you've been elected or appointed. The meeting is on Tuesday. Come on down.
Right.
And everybody sort of chooses their own adventure as to what that means.
Right. Yeah. So I think, Dr. Harrison, it is it's a very good question. I think it could be worthwhile to do some of that training. I just, having sat there, and I don't know what the specifics of the CABE training are on this subject, and maybe it's outstanding. I've just sat through a lot of like, oh wow, this is not worth my time kind of training before, and I think I probably have a lot more patience for it than other members of my board. So it would have to be very sort of solid training, and frankly leave us with a one-page document that we could look at and go, okay, oh yeah, that just refreshed, pin it to my wall here next to me, and I can always remember where that line is.
I mean, and I wonder if it's slightly far afield from the context of this tri-board governance document / work, but the extent to which the boards sort of agree to not necessarily governing principles of the tri-board, but governing principles of their roles and responsibilities. And kind of like when you have an elementary school classroom that creates its own constitution, so that they can point at the classroom wall and say, we all agreed we're not going to talk over each other.
That's right.
It's much more effective than the rule is don't talk over each other. Like, no. You all agreed that you're not going to count paper clips back on October 27th. So now that it's February 27th, you're not going to count paper clips.
Yeah, we have on our, in one of our kitchen cabinets on the inside door, our house rules, and we go back to that constantly. Now the boys point at me, say, remember, we were going to be gentle with our words and actions. Okay.
At least they're not at the level of pointing out inconsistencies in the rules yet.
Yeah.
Speak for your own self.
All right. And you know what? I would actually say, Chris, I think that work is foundational to the tri-board stuff. What we're saying is, how are we going to function as a sort of a collection of boards of education members? I think, how am I going to act as a board member is sort of foundational to that.
Right. It underpins, you can't operate as a tri-board member unless you understand how you operate as a board member.
Right.
And if all three boards have their own personalities and expectations, it leads to a very different results than if all three boards come with common expectations.
Yeah. And I also don't think that any of, what I'm describing, where people, maybe don't have the sort of what I think is the appropriate view of what the role is, I don't think any of it's done with malice.
Right.
It's all just like, I assumed, or I've always done it this way. Right. And that was what I was supposed to do. Nobody
told me anything, and this is what it seemed like. Or I talked to somebody who's on the board 6 years ago, and this is what they told me they do.
That's right.
This is what I do.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Okay.
And typically it's benign, but sometimes that waltzes you into FOI and other problems because you just assume that everything that you've been understanding is permissible.
Yeah, especially on the FOI front. I think it's so much of the sort of structure around the way that we work and the sort of limitations of what we can and can't do are sort of constrained by that. And I think I went to a training, what was that? Was that February? Maybe January or February of 2020 that they did one in Reading. Yep. And it was excellent. But I was the only person there, I don't mean in total. I think there was one member of the Reading board there, and I was there. And there were police officers there. Oh, right. You were in the back. I remember. Right. So, yeah.
But Yeah, and I think nobody intends it to be malignant. And the sort of nice side effect of pandemic land is that it's much easier to comply with FOI meeting requirements now, because you can literally say in 24 hours, I don't need to drive anywhere. I just need to be in front of a computer, and we can do this in a completely, compliant way.
Right. Maureen can be in Tennessee.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like there's a lot. I mean, I wouldn't want to make this a sort of something we need to figure out and execute before we can agree to these policies. But I do think that it's worthwhile in sort of couching the conversation from the beginning and helping people to understand, like, these are all topics that are related, is making sure that we're all clear about, sort of what our appropriate role is as board members, da, 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 da. And now let's talk about this stuff.
So for the purpose of this, why don't we assume that everybody has a common understanding of what it means to be a board member, and get this governance document to a place we're comfortable with. And then perhaps, it's fodder for next Friday to talk about what the framework is for being a board member, so that you can present them both together.
Yeah, that's good. And there's certainly policy on those topics. I think they're mostly in the bylaws section.
Yep.
I've been going through. So when I joined the board, the very first thing that I was asked to do is rewrite our bylaws. And I did that. I've now looked back at that work. We need to redo our bylaws. It's not consistent. Frankly, not all the edits that we suggested and approved as a board went into, actually ended up in those documents, and it's a mess. And so I think we punted on that because we have stated previously in the principles of this committee that each board is going to take care of its own bylaws. But that doesn't mean we have to have different bylaws. I think a walkthrough of those bylaws and an understanding of like the sort of the core principles of those, and I think a lot of that helps to sort of articulate or it helps us to sort of think through and understand the role of board members. Okay.
Can I ask one question about this section that's highlighted?
Yes.
Who would be a delegee of the board that's not a board member?
Does that mean committee?
I would think that if you're having a committee and the boards say that we want a PTA representative to be, on the interview panel for the director of XYZ, then that person would be involved in giving advice back. I think that's where the board's delegee comes in.
Here's where that I just want to raise a concern. So it would be one thing if the superintendent didn't take the advice of the board members, and then the remedy was to counsel or discipline the superintendent. But if the superintendent doesn't take the advice of delegees who may be PTA members, I feel like that's a little bit different.
It broadens your exposure, basically.
Yes.
But I don't think the next bullet solves for that, because it only reflects the board's dissatisfaction.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I do see the vagueness in the or their delegees.
I also don't know that I imagine a scenario where we would say sort of it's like getting feedback is one thing. What is the difference between sort of convening community feedback, groups and getting, sort of hearing from the PTO or hearing from the union leaders and them giving consent,
I think you can strike or their delegees, and in a circumstance where there is a delegee who is involved in the process, they should be reporting their feedback to the boards, who should report their feedback to the superintendent.
I think that's right.
And limit the number of inputs the superintendent is getting.
Board shall give advice to the superintendent in these hiring decisions. And Maureen, you were suggesting
something along the lines of which advice shall be duly considered.
We are having a fire alarm here at central office. It's planned, it's a drill,
Okay.
but I think technically we are supposed to evacuate with school children. So we'll be taking a quick break.
Very good. Well, and I think we will probably wrap. I have a hard stop at 10. Public comment? Are we okay to move on?
Yes, we
Are
are.
we okay? Okay. Public comment? None. Committee member comment? Hearing none. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion.
Thank you. Approved. We are adjourned at 9:55. Enjoy your fire drill.
Thanks.